And that is exactly where the entire foundation of human accountability just completely crumbles. Because if you treat this concept of, Satan as a spooky metaphysical ghost or like some literal monster hiding in the shadows whispering into people's ears,
Yeah.
you are completely missing the actual sociological threat to human civilization. I mean, you're looking for a boogeyman under the bed while the house is actively being robbed.
Yeah, it is the ultimate deflection of responsibility. And what we are examining today in this deep dive is a framework that just completely strips away that mythological comfort blanket.
Right.
We are diving into the mid-20th century work of Allama Parwez, specifically his analysis of Surah al-Fatir. That's chapter 35 of the Quran, starting right around verse 6. And Parwez does something here that, well, even today it feels incredibly radical.
Oh, absolutely.
He completely removes the supernatural folklore that is built up around these texts over the centuries. I mean, he applies this rigorously rational socioeconomic and linguistic lens to the passage.
Which is exactly why we're digging into this today. Because for those of you joining us, whether you are intimately familiar with this source text or you've literally never read a translated word of it, the implications of what Parwez is arguing touch the very foundation of how we build societies.
Exactly.
We are not talking about theology in the sense of like a cosmic battle between magical entities. We are talking about human sociology, the actual architecture of human economies. But wait, hold on. I need to stop you right here before we get too deep into this.
Sure, go ahead.
Because millions of people genuinely believe in a literal metaphysical devil. If Parwez is just stretching all the supernatural elements away to call it, human ego, how does he even justify that? Doesn't it sound a bit like he's just projecting modern political theories backward onto an ancient text?
It's a completely fair question, and honestly, it's the first hurdle anyone faces when reading his work. But Parwez doesn't just wave a wand and declare the supernatural void,
Yeah.
He roots his argument deeply in the linguistics of the classical Arabic used in the text.
Okay, so it's a language thing.
Yes, and he contextualizes it within the psychological evolution of humanity itself. His core argument is that early human civilizations struggled immensely with abstract concepts. I mean, when early humans couldn't conceptualize the abstract forces of nature or complex moral principles, what did they do?
Well, they personified them. It's why you get a pantheon of gods in antiquity,
Yeah,
right?
right, exactly.
You can't visually imagine the concept of a harvest or the concept of war, so you carve a statue of a harvest god or a god of war to just, focus your attention on. You turn an idea into a tangible entity.
Precisely. And Parwez suggests that this exact same psychological limitation applied to how humanity handled the abstract concept of evil, or, well, more accurately, the concept of unchecked self-interest.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, because recognizing that the drive to exploit others is an internal human flaw that's psychologically terrifying. It requires immense self-awareness. So instead of recognizing it as an internal drive, humanity personified it. We turned it into a tangible, external other.
We basically created a scapegoat.
Exactly, we created a scapegoat. But when Parwez reads the Quranic text, specifically the verses leading up to verse 6, he notes that it explicitly warns against the deception of worldly allure. And crucially, it warns against those who deceive the masses in the name of God.
Oh, wow. In the name of God.
Yes. The text literally says, do not let the deceiver deceive you about the universal system. And then it immediately identifies this deceiving force as Satan. So Parwez connects the linguistic dots here. Satan isn't a red demon with a pitchfork.
Right.
It is the principle of unchecked human emotion, aggression, and pure self-interest elevated above the collective good. In the terminology of the text, it is the human ego, the nafs, when it breaks the boundaries of natural universal law.
Okay, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around the mechanics of this, because Parwez is essentially tackling the classic philosophical problem of good and evil, right?
He is, yeah.
It's that trap where if you believe in a perfectly good creator, you have to explain why evil exists. And if you personify Satan as an external being, you run into this theological brick wall. Did the creator intentionally make a being of pure evil just to mess with us?
Yes, and Parwez resolves this by looking at how the text frames the universe itself. He points out that the universe operates on fixed, deterministic laws. He correlates these natural laws with the concept of malaika.
Which usually gets translated as angels.
Right, exactly. A term usually translated as angels, but which Parwez translates as the forces of nature. These forces have no free will, they do not possess an ego, they simply follow the program they were assigned.
They just do what they're designed to do. Like gravity doesn't wake up on a Tuesday and decide to take a day off. It just pulls. A river doesn't decide to flow uphill out of spite. It follows the path of least resistance.
Exactly. But human beings represent a completely different variable in the equation. We have intention, we have agency, we have the capacity for choice. And the mathematical reality of having the freedom to choose the right path means you must simultaneously possess the freedom to choose the wrong path.
The path of exploitation, like the path of immediate gratification at the expense of the person standing next to you.
Right. When a human being uses their free will to violate the laws that sustain collective well-being, their own unchecked ego becomes the Satan. It is not a created entity of pure evil that snuck into the universe. It is simply the misuse of human agency.
But here's where I want to push back on the terminology a bit, because Parwas makes a very specific linguistic choice here that feels, I don't know, a bit abrasive.
How so?
Well, if we're just talking about human selfishness or the human ego getting out of hand, why does the text use the specific word enemy? In the Arabic, he points out the word aduan, an open, declared enemy, and the text actually commands humanity to declare war on it.
Right, it does.
So if this is just a psychological flaw, just human selfishness, doesn't naming it a literal enemy fundamentally change how a society should function? I mean, think about it. You don't ask an enemy nicely to stop being selfish.
That is the absolute crux of Parwez's sociological argument, and it is why this deep dive is so vital for you to think about. The distinction between a flaw and an enemy changes the entire architecture of a civilization.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Well, calling unchecked self-interest a flaw makes it a personal, private matter. If you have a personal flaw, maybe you go to therapy, maybe you try to meditate and be a better person. It's an individual journey. But if you have a declared enemy operating within your borders, you don't just meditate. You build defensive structures.
I build a system that anticipates the attack. You build a defense budget.
Yes. You design legal, economic, and social frameworks to actively identify, contain, and neutralize that threat. If unchecked self-interest is the declared enemy of human progress, then a functional society cannot possibly build its economy on the premise of rewarding it.
Wow. Okay, let that sink in for a second. Think about how modern global economics actually works. We largely build institutions that specifically incentivize greed, and then we act completely shocked when society starts to fracture.
But we do. We reward it.
We reward the CEO who guts a company, fires thousands of workers, and artificially inflates the stock price to get a massive bonus. We put them on the cover of business magazines. If we take Parwez's reading seriously, we are literally allowing a declared enemy to write the rules of our society.
We're structurally capitulating to the enemy. Parwez argues that the drive to exploit others is an active hostile force against the collective survival of the species.
Right.
When you offload the responsibility for that exploitation onto an imaginary external devil, it prevents you from addressing the systemic selfishness you've woven into your laws. Every time society shrugs at corporate exploitation as just the way the market works or human nature.
We are failing to treat that exploitation as the hostile invasion it actually is.
Exactly. It's the ultimate alibi.
The devil made me do it. Or, I guess on a corporate scale, the fiduciary duty to our shareholders made me do it.
Exactly. And Parwez even points out a fascinating detail in the allegorical story of Iblis, which is another term used in the text. When Iblis rebels against the natural order, what is his excuse? He blames the system. He literally says to the creator, "You misguided me, you made me do it."
Oh, that is a profoundly sharp psychological insight.
Yeah.
The fundamental characteristic of this exploitative mindset is the absolute refusal to accept responsibility.
Yes, it is the perpetual externalization of blame. And when an entire society adopts that mindset, when the political leaders blame the marginalized for the state of the economy, when massive institutions blame the individual consumers they exploit, that society is operating on the principle of misguidance.
Which brings up a really terrifying question. Because it's one thing for an individual ego to be selfish, like one guy hoarding resources is a local problem.
Sure.
But what happens when that individual drive for extraction scales up? What happens when selfishness becomes weaponized, organized, and institutionalized?
That is precisely where the text moves next. It shifts from the individual psychology of the ego to the systemic reality of political factions. The text introduces the concept of a Hizbu Shaitan, the party of Satan.
Okay, I have to stop you again. The party of Satan. If I hear that phrase out of context, I am immediately picturing a bunch of people in a dark basement wearing heavy velvet robes, lighting black candles, and chanting in Latin.
Right, like a Hollywood cult.
Yeah. It sounds like a horror movie. How is Parwez translating this into an economic or a sociological concept?
By reading the word party hizbi in Arabic entirely literally. A party, or a faction in political and sociological terms, is not a supernatural cult. It is an organized group of people with a shared agenda.
Okay.
In parliamentary systems, you have political parties. In economics, you have corporate cartels. Parwez argues that the party of Satan is any organized, political, or economic faction that systematically promotes a program of exploitation, materialism, and deception.
So no pentagrams required, just a boardroom.
Exactly. No pentagrams. It is what happens when individual selfishness scales up and becomes a coordinated societal force. When millions of selfish egos align to extract value from the vulnerable, to suppress the values of universal justice and equity, you have a faction, you have a hizbi.
And the text gives us the actual mechanics of how this faction operates, which is where this gets incredibly relevant to today. Parwez pulls this directly from the source material. He notes that this faction doesn't always rely on brute, direct military force.
Right, because brute force is expensive.
It's expensive, it's messy.
Right.
It destroys the infrastructure you were trying to steal, and more importantly, it breeds immediate visceral resistance. I mean, if an army marches down your street, you know exactly who the enemy is, you fight back.
You do. So instead, this party uses much more insidious structural methods to subjugate populations.
And Parwez identifies 3 primary tools used by these factions, synthesized from his reading of the broader text.
Yes. The first tool is propaganda, the total control of information. The source material specifically mentions modern mediums like broadcasting, but the underlying principle is ancient and timeless.
Right.
The goal is to deceive the masses, often presenting deeply harmful extractive policies as beneficial.
Because if a lie is presented as a lie, nobody buys it. The faction doesn't hold a press conference and say, "Hi, everyone, we are here to systematically ruin your lives, drain your natural resources, and ensure your children live in debt."
No, they don't say that.
They say, "We are here to bring you freedom," or "We are bringing you the light of civilization," or "This new policy will unleash economic growth that will trickle down to you."
Yeah.
It has to be dressed up in the clothing of truth, or better yet, moral purity.
Which ties back to the warning we discussed earlier. The ultimate deception is done in the name of God, or in the name of untouchable societal values. Once they control the narrative, they deploy the second tool, which Parwez identifies as economic strangulation.
Economic strangulation.
Yes. He describes how these factions create systems that operate like a vice. They design the economic rules so that the populace is kept economically paralyzed.
Okay, let's anchor this in reality, because economic strangulation is a big term. What does that vice actually look like for an average person?
It looks like an environment where you can work 40 to 50 hours a week and still not afford basic shelter or health care.
Wow. Yeah.
The faction might allow the population to keep a small percentage of the value they generate, just enough calories to survive, just enough money to pay the rent and keep showing up to work, but the faction retains the vast majority of the surplus value. They monopolize the resources, they control the debt.
It's the illusion of participation. You're allowed to play the game, and they tell you that if you work hard enough, you can win. But the house always wins, because the house designed the rules specifically so you can never leave the table. You see this with predatory lending, right? Or when massive corporate landlords buy up all the starter homes in a city, ensuring an entire generation is permanently stuck paying exorbitant rent, completely unable to build any generational wealth. That is a vice.
Yes, and the brilliance, the dark brilliance of the party of Satan is that they make this vice feel like a natural occurrence, which leads to their third and perhaps most devastating tool, the hijacking of the educational systems. Because if you want to ensure long-term generational subjugation, you don't just control the current adult population, you indoctrinate their children. Parwez notes that the goal of this faction is to mold the minds of the youth so that they are born into intellectual servitude.
You teach them a version of history, economics, and morality that completely justifies the faction's dominance.
Exactly. You teach them that the system of exploitation is actually just the natural, unchangeable order of the universe.
I mean, if you can convince someone that their poverty or their subservience is just how nature works,
Right.
or worse, what God intended, they won't fight back.
They won't.
They will literally police themselves. They will defend the very system that is crushing them. You see people arguing vehemently against their own economic interests because they've been educated to believe that taxing a billionaire is somehow a moral failing.
And this leads to a crucial clarification regarding the text's warning about the ultimate fate of this faction. The verse warns that the followers of this party will end in the blazing fire.
Right, the blazing fire.
Now, in a traditional theological reading, this is a literal threat about hellfire in the afterlife. Be bad, go to hell when you die. But Parwez argues this is a demonstrable historical pattern occurring right here in the material world.
So it's not a spooky afterlife threat.
Not at all. The blazing fire is the inevitable social collapse. It is the violent revolution, the civil war, the total societal ruin that mathematically follows unchecked exploitation.
Because a system built purely on extraction eventually runs out of things to extract. It's like a parasite that kills its host. The host dies, but the parasite dies too. It burns itself to the ground.
Exactly. And Parwez does a fascinating linguistic deep dive here to explain the mechanics of this cycle of ruin. He contrasts the two words used in the Quran for this force, Shaitan and Iblis.
Which people usually think are just the same thing, right?
Right. In conventional readings, people think these are just two different names for the same supernatural demon. But Parwez argues they represent two distinct phases of a sociological cycle. They are two sides of the same coin. The root of the word shaitan implies burning, flaming up, aggression, and crossing limits. It is the heat of unchecked ambition.
The text even mentions the physical reality of human anger, how your body temperature literally rises, your face flushes, your heart races when you are enraged. It is a biological flame.
Right. It is the expansionist phase. But what happens after a fire burns through all its fuel? What happens after the aggression reaches its absolute limit?
It burns out.
You enter the second phase. The root of the word iblis, coming from bals or ablas, means despair, frustration, deep regret, and the inability to move forward. Parwez connects this to modern psychological and sociological theories of aggression and frustration.
Okay, so Shaitan leads to Iblis.
Yes. Every act of unbridled aggression, the Shaitan phase, inevitably leads to a catastrophic crash, a state of deep frustration and societal despair, the Iblis phase.
This is a massive paradigm shift. Let's map this onto human history for a second. A society driven by the Shaitan principle is burning hot. It is aggressive. Think of the height of the Roman Empire or the rapid expansion of a colonial power.
Oh, absolutely.
Pure materialism, aggressive expansion, exploiting workers, conquering neighbors. From the outside, it looks incredibly powerful. It looks unstoppable. But internally, it is completely consuming its own foundation.
It is structurally unsustainable. The wealth inequality becomes too extreme. The infrastructure rots because all the capital is hoarded at the top. The marginalized population is pushed beyond its physical and psychological breaking point.
And the institutions lose all legitimacy because everyone realizes they are built on lies and propaganda.
And then comes the Iblis phase, the collapse, the frustration. The society looks around at the ashes of what it burned and falls into despair. It realizes it has destroyed the very planet it needs to survive, or the very social fabric required for peace.
So the blazing fire isn't a magical punishment from the sky. It is the mathematical result of the equation they wrote themselves. If you build a house out of gasoline and matches, you don't need a supernatural entity to set it on fire. The physics of the situation will take care of it.
That is a perfect articulation of the concept. The historical evidence for this civilizational pattern is overwhelming. Every empire built purely on subjugation, every society structured around the hoarding of wealth by a tiny elite at the expense of the masses, has eventually faced this blazing fire.
The social fabric tears.
Exactly. This is the macroscopic blueprint Parwez is uncovering in these verses. It is not theology, it is a warning about the physics of sociology.
Think about the world right now. Where are we seeing this cycle play out in real time? Where are we seeing the Shaitan phase of aggressive hyper-extraction, where a few megacorporations own almost everything? And where are we seeing the inevitable Iblis phase of societal frustration, political polarization, and widespread despair?
It's everywhere.
It can feel incredibly bleak when you look at the collapsing infrastructure around us.
Yeah.
But right as you start to contemplate the absolute despair of this cycle, the text does something highly unexpected. It pivots. Hard.
Yes. Moving into Ayat 9, the imagery in the text shifts dramatically. We move entirely away from the sociology of destruction and suddenly enter the science of meteorology.
It's such a sudden transition. We literally go from organized factions burning in the fire of their own making to God sends the winds which drive the clouds, which pour rain onto a dead land, bringing it back to life.
Right.
If you are just casually reading the translation, you might get whiplash. You might think, okay, the author just got distracted and wanted to write a nice poem about the weather.
Right.
But Parwez argues, this isn't poetic filler at all.
No, it is a precise, calculated metaphor. Parwez explains that this meteorological process is not a description of a localized miracle. It is the articulation of a natural law, specifically the law of civilizational revival.
The law of revival. Okay.
Just as there is a systemic law for societal collapse, the unchecked aggression leading to the blazing fire of ruin, there is a repeatable systemic law for societal renewal.
Okay, let's explore this metaphor because I think it's brilliant, but I want to make sure we ground it. If civilizational collapse is mathematically guaranteed by extractive systems, how does humanity ever survive? Is there a mechanism to hit the reset button before the fire burns everything?
Let's start with the wind.
Yeah, the text says the winds are sent first to drive the clouds. If the dead land represents a stagnant, dying civilization, a society stuck in that Iblis phase of total despair, what does the wind represent at the level of social or intellectual history?
The wind represents a new paradigm, an ideological shift. It is the movement of a new truth, a new socioeconomic theory, or a revolutionary idea sweeping through a stagnant environment.
Like fresh air.
Think about a stagnant, humid day. The air is oppressive. Nothing moves. Before the rain can fall, the atmosphere itself must change. The wind disrupts the stagnant air. In a society, this might be a massive intellectual movement like the Enlightenment, or a technological breakthrough that democratizes how we communicate, or a visionary manifesto articulating a system of justice that openly challenges the exploitative status quo.
The wind is the disruption. It's the sudden collective realization that things do not actually have to be this way. It shakes the dust off the institutions, and then the wind gathers the clouds.
And Parwez aligns the clouds with life-giving laws and systems.
And those clouds pour rain onto the dead land.
Yeah.
The rain is the application of truth. It's not just talking about a better world. It's the actual implementation of a system based on collective well-being rather than unchecked self-interest.
Exactly. When a society aligns itself with these universal laws of justice, equity, and mutual care, when the rain falls, it revives. It begins to produce fruit again. The economy stabilizes, the culture flourishes, human dignity is restored. This is a natural consequence of alignment, not a magical intervention from the sky.
But, and this is a massive but, there is a crucial caveat here that Parwez introduces, and I think it might be the most important and terrifying part of this entire analysis. The rain only revives land that still has the potential for life.
This is a vital detail from the source text. The passage uses the concept of bringing a dead land to life, but Parwez clarifies what dead means in this specific context. He distinguishes between land that is dormant and wood that is entirely rotten.
Right. If you have a barren field that has just been in a severe drought for 5 years, but the soil still has nutrients, it still has seeds buried deep inside it, if you pour water on that, it springs to life. You get grass, you get flowers.
It revives.
But if you have a piece of wood that is completely rotted through, that has lost all its structural integrity and turned to pulp, well, what happens when you pour water on it?
It just turns into mush. It decays faster. The water accelerates its destruction. Parwez applies this biological reality to human civilizations using the concept of arzu, which translates to deep desire, yearning, or the will to live.
Arzu?
Yes. For a civilization to be revived by the reign of a new, just system, the populace must still possess arzu. They must still have a fundamental spark of potential, a collective desire to change and to live dynamically.
If a society has completely surrendered to apathy, if the people have become so cynical, so beaten down by the daily grind of the party of Satan that they no longer even want justice, or they no longer believe a better world is conceptually possible, they are the rotten wood.
That is the ultimate tragedy Parwez highlights. He contrasts arzu with the psychological state of Hazrat.
Hazrat, what does that mean exactly?
Hazrat is a deep, exhausted despair. It is a state where one has waited so long for change and been disappointed so many times that the very capacity to hope is broken. If a nation reaches that absolute state of internal decay, where the moral compass is entirely shattered, where corruption is accepted as a permanent reality, and the will to fight for equity is gone, then no new ideology, no new system, no matter how perfect the manifesto is, can save it.
Oh, wow.
The reign of a new system will just wash the rotten wood away.
That is genuinely chilling, because it places the ultimate responsibility right back on our shoulders. The universe provides the wind and the rain, the natural laws of renewal, the blueprints for an equitable society are always available to us, but we have to maintain the soil.
We're doing it.
We have to keep the arzu, that spark of desire for a better system, alive, even when the political and economic climate is incredibly dry. Think about the people around you. Think about the pervasive cynicism on social media, the doom scrolling, the sheer exhaustion of the modern worker. Are we fostering Arzu, or are we surrendering to Hazrat?
It's a fine line.
Because cynicism isn't just a bad mood. According to this text, societal cynicism is the ultimate victory for the party of Satan. It turned us into rotten wood.
It is a profound diagnostic question for any civilization, and it leads directly into the final phase of the societal life cycle outlined in these verses. Let's assume the optimistic path. Let's assume a society does have that spark of Arzu.
Okay, let's be optimistic.
Let's assume they receive the rain, they implement the natural laws of justice, and the dead land springs back to life. The civilization is revived, the economy is fair, and the society is thriving.
Awesome. We did it. Society is great again. But human nature being what it is, the second things are going well, the inevitable question arises: who gets the credit? Who is in charge now? Who gets to sit at the head of the table?
Naturally.
And this brings us to Ayat 10, and a concept that completely breaks the human mold. The idea that honor belongs to the system alone.
This is where we examine verse 10, and it is perhaps the most radical socioeconomic statement in the entire passage. The text directly addresses this exact human tendency to claim ownership over success. The verse states that whoever desires honor, and the Arabic word used here is izzat.
Izzat.
Yes, izzat, which is a very heavy word encompassing honor, power, dignity, prestige, and respect. Whoever desires this must know that all izzat belongs entirely to God. But remember Parwez's framework, he translates this sociologically.
Right, no supernatural stuff.
God, in this functional, civilizational context, represents the divine system, the universal laws of justice and equity.
So it's saying all honor belongs to the system. I really need to unpack this because I am struggling to see how this practically functions. This translation is incredibly radical. It completely dismantles the way human beings have structured every society since the dawn of time.
It really does.
Historically, how do we assign honor and power?
We assign it based on possession, lineage, and accumulation. We give honor to the ruling tribe. We give honor to the aristocracy, to the people born into the right families with the right last names.
Or in modern times, we give it to the wealthiest class, the billionaires.
Exactly. Or in religious structures, we give it to a specific clergy who claim to be the exclusive gatekeepers of the divine. Throughout history, humanity has treated izzat as tangible property, something you can hoard in a vault, inherit through your DNA, and pass down to your children regardless of their actual character or their actions.
But if all honor belongs entirely to the universal system of laws, it means no human being, no family, no corporation, and no class can own it. It is not property. You cannot hoard dignity in an offshore bank account, and you cannot inherit respect through your bloodline.
Exactly. Honor becomes entirely conditional. It becomes a consequence of alignment. Parwez argues that a person, a leader, or an entire nation only possesses true dignity and power as long as they are actively aligned with the laws that promote the collective good. The very second a faction, no matter how historically prestigious they are, no matter how much money they have, breaks that alignment to serve their own selfish interests, they lose their true honor.
Wow.
They might still have billions of dollars, they might still command a massive military, but they have lost their izzat. They have become the rotten wood.
Okay, let's explore the real-world implications of this because I find this fascinating. How does detaching honor from birthright, lineage, or hoarded wealth fundamentally alter a society's incentive structure?
It changes everything.
Think about how you and I live today. If you live in a society where honor is inextricably tied to wealth, which is essentially global capitalism, the ultimate incentive is to acquire wealth by any means necessary, because wealth equals respect. Wealth equals power, influence, and safety. The system actively incentivizes you to become the Satan we talked about earlier, to elevate your self-interest above everything else.
Right. The current system incentivizes the creation of the party of Satan. Because if I can exploit 1,000 workers, suppress their wages, and destroy a local ecosystem to amass $1 billion, society will not shun me. Society will reward me.
You'll be on TV.
I will be invited to give TED Talks. I will be granted massive political influence. I will possess immense izzat. The underlying incentive structure of most modern economies rewards the pathology of extraction.
But if the society actually internalized Ayat 10, if we truly believe and structurally enforce the idea that honor belongs only to the system of collective well-being, the entire economy flips.
It flips on its head.
The billionaire who exploited people to get his wealth wouldn't be honored. He wouldn't be on a magazine cover. He would be viewed as a systemic threat. He would be viewed as a criminal against the natural law.
It creates a true meritocracy, but not a meritocracy of extraction, a meritocracy of character and systemic contribution. If honor cannot be inherited, it means every single generation must earn its dignity from scratch by realigning with the principles of justice.
You can't just coast on your ancestors.
No political dynasty can say, listen to us because our grandfather founded this country. Their authority is only valid if their current actions align with the universal good. No religious clergy can say, obey us because we hold the historical text. Their authority vanishes the moment they protect their institutional power over the vulnerable. It completely democratizes dignity.
It is the ultimate anti-corruption mechanism. You can't rest on your laurels. You can't hack the system. The system says your grandfather was aligned with the law of collective care, so he had honor. You are acting out of unchecked ego and hoarding resources, so you have none.
And this brings us back perfectly to Parwez's central thesis regarding these verses. The text is a constant, unyielding fight against the human desire to establish permanent, unaccountable hierarchies.
We really love our hierarchies.
We do. Whether it is externalizing our own internal flaws onto a mythological devil so we don't have to change our behavior, or claiming permanent honor based on our hoarded wealth so we don't have to act justly. Humans are always looking for a loophole. We are always looking for a way to avoid the hard, daily work of alignment.
You want the cheat codes.
Yeah.
We want to be able to do whatever we want, extract whatever we want, without ever facing the blazing fire of social consequence. But the laws of sociology, much like the laws of meteorology, don't care about our cheat codes.
They don't.
Gravity doesn't care how rich you are. If you step off a cliff, you fall. And the law of societal collapse doesn't care how powerful your faction is. If you build a system purely on extraction, you will eventually burn.
If we pull back and look at the macroscopic journey of these 4 verses, from defining the enemy as the unchecked ego, to the organized faction of exploitation, to the meteorological law of renewal, and finally to the true conditional source of honor, we see a highly cohesive, airtight argument.
We do. And it becomes blindingly clear that this text, through Parwez's lens, is absolutely not a manual for individual theological salvation. It isn't just telling you how to be a nice, quiet person so you can go to a pleasant place when you die.
No.
It is a vast blueprint of the 2 grand forces of human history.
On one side, you have the force of misguidance, individualism, exploitation, the unchecked ego, the party of Satan. This force relies on propaganda and economic strangulation. It treats honor as property, and it always mathematically leads to civilizational collapse and despair.
And on the other side, you have the force of renewal. The alignment with natural law, the commitment to the collective good, the systemic revival represented by the rain bringing a dormant land back to life.
Right.
This force insists that honor and power are not human property, but the natural temporary results of acting in accordance with universal justice. These are the 2 forces competing for the architecture of every single human society that has ever existed and that will ever exist.
When civilizations stand at a crossroads, as we arguably do today, the question is never about which supernatural entity is winning a cosmic war. The question is entirely about which of these 2 socioeconomic forces we are allowing to design our institutions.
So we want to leave you with a final puzzle to mull over as you look at the world around you. We are living in an era where global civilizations are more interconnected than ever, but frankly, in many places, the land is looking pretty dry. The soil is cracking. Are we building systems that treat unchecked self-interest as a virtue to be rewarded with honor and power? Or are we going to build systems that recognize unchecked self-interest as a declared enemy, structurally neutralizing it so that the reign of collective renewal can finally fall?